What's the Titanic got to do with it? What caused the Titanic to sink? Seems like a simple answer. It struck an iceberg. But that's only the final blow to a series of events and choices which ended in the death of over 1,500 passengers and crew. See, the Titanic was touted as the largest, strongest, most modern passenger vessel in the world. It was about 882 feet long, constructed entirely of steel plates that were riveted together to form its massive hull, with specialized compartments that would seal closed if they became flooded with seawater. Half of these compartments could flood and the ship would still float. It was reported to be unsinkable by its owners and designers. The ship's Captain Smith said only an act of God could sink the Titanic. But was it God or the choices of men that ultimately sank the greatest ship in the world? Let's look at some facts as recorded by survivors and crew. First, the maiden voyage was a huge promotion for the White Star Line, a British shipping company. This ship had to leave the port on time and make it from Southampton to New York City in record time to avoid ridicule of these gigantic Olympic-class vessels or the White Star Line. Second, the ship was constructed of overlapping steel plates held together by more than 3 million rivets, since welding was very new and crude at the time. These rivets were cast and then heated and hammered into holes drilled in plates. Some of these rivets were poorly cast, but considered good enough for the job. These rivets were found to be in the area of the breach in the hull after hitting the iceberg, possibly adding to the failure. Third, there was a coal strike in Europe at the time, so the White Star Line took all their available coal, plus purchased all the coal they could from other shipping companies and placed it in the Titanic. This left them without coal for any possible rescue ships. Fourth, there was a fire that started burning in one of the coal bunkers below decks. This fire was burning for 10 days before the ship sailed and wasn't put out until April 14th, the day before the collision with the iceberg. The fire had discolored the starboard side of the hull in an area of the poorly cast rivets, same area that was struck by the iceberg. This fact was hidden from the public, especially news photographers, by having the passengers board the Titanic from the opposite side, the port side. Fifth, the second mate quit a few days before the Titanic sailed. Another took his place but neglected to get the keys to the vaults that held the binoculars. So the ship sailed loaded with beer and champagne but no access to binoculars. This hampered the ability of the sailors in the crow's nest to see anything far off in the distance. If they had binoculars, they may have been able to warn the bridge in time to avoid the collision. As it turned out, by the time they signaled the bridge, it was too late. Sixth, there were no maritime laws concerning the number of lifeboats that were mandatory for passenger vehicles in the early 1900s. Titanic had 2,200 passengers and crew, and each lifeboat could hold 60 people. Titanic was originally designed to have 40 lifeboats. However, designers thought it looked too crowded and the lifeboats distracted from the aesthetic appearance of the vessel. So they decided to have only 20 lifeboats on board. This meant there were enough lifeboats to handle only half the passengers and crew. Also, on the day of the disaster, the captain decided to forego the lifeboat drills as he felt they were just an inconvenience for first-class passengers. Seventh, the ship was behind schedule for a few reasons, but two of the most outstanding were: one, the sister ship Olympic was being repaired after a collision with the HMS Hawk. So work on Titanic was delayed for months because they used parts from the Titanic, which was still under construction. And two, when Titanic left port, she too almost had a collision in the harbor with the vessel SS New York City. This near miss of less than 4 feet caused more than an hour delay in the ship's departure, and running on schedule was a focal point of shipping companies. So Captain Smith ran at full speed, even after being notified they were sailing in an area where icebergs had been seen. So think about this. Captain knew they didn't have binoculars, so the lookouts couldn't see any great distance with clarity, yet he chose to plow forward at full speed, in order to get to New York City on schedule. Lastly, Titanic was equipped with the latest wireless radio telegraph system of the day. It could send and receive messages at great distances. The Titanic's telegraph operator received multiple messages from various ships sailing in the same shipping lane, telling of ice floats and icebergs in the area. At one point, the USS California sent a message that they were stopped mid-ocean, surrounded by ice floats and icebergs. The Titanic's operator told him to shut up, I'm too busy now. He was busy sending messages from passengers to the mainland and was so swamped they had to send them around the clock to catch up. Another warning chosen to be ignored. When the Titanic finally struck the iceberg, there was very little shaking on board, according to some of the passengers. Some surviving passengers said it was just 3 little bumps and that was it. Others said they went on deck and saw the railing of the ship rubbing against the iceberg and peeling off mounds of snow-like ice. They asked the crew if there was a problem. The crew calmly said, "No, we've just hit an iceberg." So these same passengers started to have a snowball fight on deck. Meanwhile, below decks, the hull was separating and the seawater was rushing in, slowly killing the ship, passengers, and crew. So many of the advanced systems on board, like lowering the lifeboats, were so new to the crew that they either did it wrong or poorly, and the majority of the lifeboats were dropped into the sea with less than half of the available seats occupied. By the time the passengers figured out there weren't going to be enough lifeboats for everyone, it was too late. So what does this have to do with it? It is our life in Jesus Christ. The book of Jeremiah tells us that God has a good plan for us, but free will, our choices, even though small, can change the course of our lives. A move of just 1 degree off course can take you miles away from your destiny over your lifespan. For example, from Sarasota to New York City is about 1,170 miles. If you're flying off course by just 1 degree, you will wind up 20.3 miles out in the Atlantic Ocean. That's just one small choice. But now add another, then another, until you are headed in a direction that is nowhere near your God-given destiny. So we press harder and run faster to get back on track because we know we are behind schedule. Instead, we should be standing still, listening and looking for a leading from God. But rather than listen, we plunge head on into troubles. We stop looking at God and start looking at everything around us, all the outside influences that alter our choices and decisions. A number of things could have prevented the Titanic from taking its fateful voyage. However, no one stopped to listen or say something. They could have chosen to not use the faulty rivets. Someone could have reported the fire to harbor officials who could have stopped the departure from Southampton. However, they were too focused on what man wanted and forgot to listen to God speaking. We must listen to the voice of God, however He speaks to your heart. Sometimes it's in dreams or a vision, a billboard, or even a TV show. Sometimes it's just something you feel inside you that will cause you such uneasiness that you squirm in your seat. But whatever it is, we must hear from God and do what He says. Even in the small details of our daily lives, we must listen. You have to understand that God will give a warning before any disaster. He'll send a messenger, an angel, a prophet. He can even make a donkey speak when needed. God sent multiple warnings that went unheeded, but the biggest warning I found was a book written 14 years before the Titanic set sail. The book was called The Wreck of the Titan by Morgan Robertson. In his 1898 fictional book, Robertson wrote of a great ship made completely out of steel. See, most of the ships of the day were mainly wooden with metal added in certain places. The Titan was 900 feet long, about the same size as Titanic. It was built with compartments that could be flooded and the ship would still stay afloat, just like Titanic. In Robertson's story, the ship didn't have enough lifeboats for the amount of passengers. In fact, it had the same number as Titanic. In the story, the Titan was said to be unsinkable. Sound familiar? Then the author's final warning. The Titan would sink around midnight in April in the Atlantic Ocean after hitting an iceberg. You see, God can use anyone to give a prophetic warning, and I believe that's what he did with Robertson's book, The Wreck of the Titan. He was warning people not to be so pride-filled to think that they could make the 1912 version of the Tower of Babel, but no one heard his warning. Proverbs 16:18 says, "Pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall." That pretty much sums it up. In conclusion, hitting the iceberg was the final blow to Titanic, but all the decisions, the choices made up to that point only added to the vulnerability of the vessel and its final catastrophic demise. When the Titanic set sail from England, there were people of all nationalities, races, religions, and classes on board. After Titanic sank, there were only two classes of people listed on a chalkboard in an office in England: those known to be lost, those known to be saved. God has given you a warning. Listen to his voice and watch for his signs to you that will guide you not only toward your destiny, but to an everlasting life with him. God will speak to your heart. Listen and be saved.